From the Bloomberg Bureau in downtown Washington, D.C. to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm Kevin Cirilli.
And I'm Taylor Riggs from New York. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. And Kevin, we go straight to that world of business, and we do that with Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Abigail, how much of the stimulus is really going into the hopes and optimism that we see in the markets today?
It's certainly a piece of it, Taylor, because we do have synchronized all-time highs for the Dow, the S&P 500, the NASDAQ 100, and the Russell 2000. So any flavor of equity, they are climbing higher. A piece of it, again, that stimulus, the idea that the economy is going to have that extra boost of money and that Americans will be helped. But I think that the bigger thing happening here is you just have this melt up over the last, frankly, the entire year out of the March lows. But more recently, it's just been record high after record high with a little bit of consolidation. Right now, we're entering an official Santa Claus rally. That's when you have stocks rallying over the last 5 days of 1 year into the first 2 days of the new year. We don't know for sure, but right now we're up more than 1% over that time period, confirming the risk-on mood, Taylor, the idea that folks just want stocks to go higher, risk assets to go higher. We have bonds lower. Interesting, the 10-year yield, though, still unable to get above that 1%.
I do know what's able to move more than 1% today, and that's Bitcoin. I'm hoping your Christmas looked like mine. I was sitting around the dinner table and everyone's buying Bitcoin. What's going on?
Yeah, Taylor, Bitcoin really on fire. You can't go anywhere without hearing about Bitcoin. And of course, over the weekend, putting in an all-time high above 28,000. It's incredible given the fact that at the March lows, it was around 4,000. So Bitcoin up more than, in a huge way over that time period. Over the last 3 months, up about 150%. It's unclear what's going on here, Taylor, because in terms of its actual use in the real world, it doesn't seem to be any more widespread. Yet you have this Fed liquidity. Ironically, Bitcoin is meant to be a hedge against it. But as stocks have gone up so much, you have to wonder, are investors looking for more of a home for that liquidity? And it's finding Bitcoin. It's worth noting, though, not as much institutional participation here, so perhaps more speculation. Unclear whether or not this time is different. Will we have the boom and the bust? That's what history suggests, but right now, Bitcoin is on fire.
Fascinating. Abigail Doolittle, thanks for that perspective, especially as it relates to the growing Bitcoin storyline that we've all been following. I want to bring in now Jeanne Zaino, a Bloomberg contributor and a political science professor at Iona College. Jeanne, here in Washington, D.C., the fallout still being dissected in terms of President Trump's signing of that fiscal stimulus deal. What do you think made him change his mind?
Yeah, we were all sort of on pins and needles waiting to see whether he would or wouldn't. And as you mentioned, late Sunday, he did sign the $2.3 trillion package. And I think we never quite know what is in his mind, but I think the speculation is that Republicans who were lobbying him made the case that this was not only bad for Republicans in Georgia, in the Senate leadership and elsewhere, but it was also bad for President Trump's legacy and anything he plans to or wants to do once he leaves office. And I think we saw him do that. I think we also saw him get some political cover in terms of this signing statement. So I think those two things combined gave him sort of the push he needed to sign this, of course, after we saw the benefits lapse, which puts a lot of people in jeopardy, at least for a period of time.
But Jeanne, how does this set up Trump with some of the other Republicans, pitting them against each other? Larry Summers, who we're speaking to next, says it may be good politics for the Dems to capitalize on that, but maybe not good economics.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think we're seeing the Democrats today are going to try to capitalize on this. I don't think Democrats believe that they will be able to get $2,000 checks. But I do think at the very least they want to put Republicans on record to vote against it. And of course, it also is important to note that we are just about a week away from the all-important runoff in Georgia. And you have these two Republican senators down there fighting for their lives. And they have had to, endure this idea that potentially their constituents who they want to vote wouldn't be getting these checks before the vote, which would hurt both of them. So I think, it does create an enormous problem for Republicans to be, as you said, pitted against each other. I also think Democrats are doing what they can to make sure that their voters and Republican voters know that they agree with the president on this and they want bigger checks and they want Republicans to have to vote against that.
See, I find this fascinating. And Taylor, I totally agree with your point about how crucial this issue is playing in the closing arguments, and Jeanne, the point that you're making as well, in the Georgia runoff election. But play this even forward beyond Georgia. Once President-elect Biden is sworn in, he's going to need people like Senator Susan Collins, Senator Mitt Romney, other more centrist Republicans if he wants to get another round of economic relief. And dare I say, in the past week or so, we've heard praise on this particular issue of $2,000 checks from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, saying that they agree with President Trump that more funds are needed. So do you think, in a way, that this is an opportunity for the incoming administration, Jeanne, to capitalize on when they make their case for more fiscal relief?
I absolutely do. I think we're going to see Joe Biden, who understands, as we know, how this game is played, and his administration try to hug on to this idea that it is not just him out there, painted as some liberal who wants to increase these payments and who wants to give a bigger stimulus, if you will, package. But this is something the outgoing Republican president, who remains very popular with the base, wanted as well. So I think Republicans in the majority in the Senate and more conservative fiscal Republicans have got to be incredibly frustrated by the way this has played itself out. And I think we are going to see a real sort of reckoning in terms of the Republican Party once Trump does leave office as to how they play this. And of course, as you mentioned, a lot of this depends on what happens in Georgia on January 5th and who indeed controls the Senate. But regardless of who controls it, either way, it's going to be a very narrow margin on either side. And that's going to mean, at least in my mind, that we're not going to see a really, really large package like Biden hopes to have and many economists think we should have. I don't think we're going to see that regardless of who wins down in Georgia.
So, Jeanne, push us forward to January 5th. All eyes, of course, are on Georgia. Is it just a Senate race, or are there some more local issues going on that you're looking at for our national audience?
Well, I think so much of the national focus, as you mentioned, has been on who controls the Senate, obviously, and that's what we're seeing a lot of. I was just looking at the money coming into the Georgia race. Those numbers just came in the other day, and they brought in an incredible $300 million, with Ossoff leading that charge at over $106 million between October and December. So those are outstanding numbers, and all of the candidates brought in. Warnock, $100 million. Purdue and Loeffler in the 60s. But as you mentioned, it's not just about the Senate majority. It's also about issues that are important to Georgia residents and Georgia voters. We've seen a huge number in terms of the turnout down in Georgia. I think it's over 2.1 million have already voted down there, which is incredible. And I think we're going to see a huge turnout for runoff. And that has to do because these issues matter to people in Georgia. I don't think this is a runaway for the Democrats by any stretch of the imagination. This actually probably favors Republicans historically. But again, if you look at the money coming in, Democrats are taking in more money, and we haven't seen a lot of polling on this race. So I think one of the curious things is we don't really know which way this thing is going at this point, because many of the pollsters pulled out after the general election. So we're seeing bits and spurts of polls, but the public polls, we have a dearth of those. And so we don't really know how this thing is going to play itself out. I think the most we can say is turnout is going to matter an awful lot down there.
Well, when we do know, we know that you'll be back on to help us digest all of that news. Jeanne Zaino, our Bloomberg contributor, thank you as always for your time. And make sure to stay with us because, Kevin, coming up, the Twitterverse is all up in arms over comments that Larry Summers has made on stimulus. We're going to hear from him next, the former Treasury Secretary, on clarification around his comments and those stimulus checks. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington.
And I'm Taylor Riggs in New York. And Kevin, we have a great guest coming up. Remember last week it was former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers really taking social media on fire and the world of Twitter. He did tell us on Bloomberg Television here that the $2,000 stimulus checks would be a mistake. Joining us now, Bloomberg contributor and that former Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers. Mr. Summers, great to have you on the program. Clarify, perhaps, why you said what you did.
Look, we need to help people. There are millions of people who desperately need help, especially right now, given COVID, but at all times, as inequality has risen and our economy has stagnated. The question isn't whether there's a need to help people. The question is, what's the best way to help people? And my judgment is that an across-the-board gift to 85% of taxpayers of a kind that no one thinks can be sustained every quarter is a mistake. We don't need tax cuts for example, my adult children. We need help for the unemployed. We need help to make sure that the frontline workers are being taken care of. We need help to make sure that as much resources as possible are going to testing and vaccinating so we can put this in the rear view mirror. The focus on $2,000 checks is a kind of political opportunism because everybody thinks to themselves, why shouldn't I get some money? But in terms of helping those who are most in need, in terms of strengthening our economic future, our problem is not an across-the-board lack of purchasing power. Our problem is people in need who should be helped in targeted ways, and our problem is investing in the future of our country. And the $2,000 proposal isn't that. I'm not, originally when the stimulus bill was conceived, there weren't any tax cuts here in the second round. There was an attempt to find people who were in need and help them. I think that might have been a better approach, but I can see an argument for giving something to everybody. But here's one statistic your listeners should keep in mind. Wages and salaries are running about $30 billion a month below what they would have if COVID hadn't happened. We should make that up. Maybe we should make that up 2 times over.
Okay.
But even before you got to the increase to $2,000, we were making it up 7 times over. I'm not sure I see a reason to take that from 7 times over to 10 or 20 times over. Better to target and to invest.
Larry, in your column, you write that the $2,000 direct payments would, quote, overheat an economy on pace, would overheat the economy. The economy is on pace to contract 5% year over year with 1.2% inflation. You argue, in terms of your argument, when I talk to small business leaders, when I talk to employees of these small businesses, for restaurants, for example, where people are unable to get back to work, how would not providing immediate economic relief provide assistance, not just to those individuals, but to their families? They literally are not able to go back to work because in cities across the country, stores, restaurants, and other gym institutions have been shut down by their local governments as a result of health concerns.
I'm for compensating anybody who's been shut down by their local government. That's part of what the targeted PPP program is about. I think we should be putting more money into targeted programs for people whose economic lives are being disrupted in order to protect the rest of us from COVID. Absolutely. We've got to think about reality. Not every one of those restaurants can probably be bridged to the post-COVID future. But the principle is target where there is a big problem. There are also millions and millions of families who, for whatever reason, have a household income higher than they might have expected to have before COVID, who are going to be getting these $8,000 if it's a family of 4 under the proposal. And I don't think that's well advised, but absolutely target those who are in need, target those who are sacrificing, make the necessary investments to grow our economy. Look, we have to think not just about what's going to feel good this week or next week. We've got to think about what's going to leave us in the best position over time. And I think that's targeted assistance and investment. I've been an advocate, I've called it the secular stagnation theory for years now, of consistently more expansionary fiscal policy and less austerity. That's not what we're debating, nor are we debating whether inequality is a problem. We're debating whether Donald Trump's new idea that hadn't been in the political and economic debate before 2 weeks ago, of giving out $2,000 checks to everybody, is the right way for government to protect people and enlarge their opportunity. And I don't think it is.
All right, we'll leave it there. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers talking about that column from Bloomberg Opinion. And you can hear more with Larry Summers on Bloomberg Quick Take. Taylor, really a fascinating column that ignited the ideological debate that President Trump really opened up before, of course, signing into law. But I can tell you that here in Washington, D.C., the Republicans are really openly debating this issue, and they're weighing the $27 trillion national debt with the need for immediate fiscal relief. But it's an ideological collision course between the various contingencies here in Washington.
And all the economists in D.C. and New York as well. So you don't worry about fiscal stimulus and the deficit. I'm sorry, you don't worry about the deficit in the times of war. But you know, the former Treasury Secretary brings up a good point, Kevin, that in the beginning of all of this, that first round of big stimulus, there was such a hurry that we maybe overlooked some of the fine details. Now, of course, we've had 9 months to debate and discuss the second round. Perhaps maybe Larry Summers hinting that having a more targeted approach, perhaps to really help those in need and not help people who haven't seen their income reduced at all.
We have to keep in mind, though, the people who want to get back to work, who just can't get back to work because of the local regulations that have prevented them from being able to find work. So a really intense situation that, candidly, is a lot different outside of the Acela corridor.
Let's get some more of that intense information with the First Word News update, and we can do that here with Karina Mitchell.
Okay, thank you. European Union nations have unanimously approved the post-Brexit trade deal with the United Kingdom. The approval had been expected ever since the deal was announced, and all EU leaders warmly welcomed it. It still needs approval from the EU's legislature, which is expected to come in February. The UK's House of Commons is expected to approve it Wednesday. Meanwhile, European Union countries have begun vaccinating against COVID-19 as members of the 27-nation bloc struggle with a rising death toll from the virus. The coordinated rollout is getting underway less than a week after the EU cleared a shot developed by Pfizer and BioNTech. It will take months to inoculate enough people to have an impact on the spread of the disease. Meanwhile, Belgian authorities report the country's COVID-19 infection rates, hospitalizations, and deaths are declining. That as the country moved to tighten restrictions on incoming travelers and on residents, including no more than one guest at home. Bars and restaurants remain closed. Belgium's average daily infection rate over the past week was just over 2,000, a 15% decrease from the previous week. Deaths fell by 13%. Here at home, Southwest Airlines says it will rescind planned job and wage cuts scheduled for the new year now that new federal payroll support is on the way. U.S. Airlines will receive $15 billion to pay workers temporarily as part of the package President Trump signed into law Sunday night. Bloomberg estimates the airline could get up to $2 billion. The lifeline averts what would have been the first worker layoffs in the history of the airline. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Karina Mitchell. This is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Taylor Riggs in New York. And Kevin, we go right to our stock of the hour. Bitcoin, Riot blockchain, anything related is pretty much at a 2020 high. Abigail Doolittle's here with more. Abigail, what are you looking at as it relates to all things Riot blockchain?
It's incredible, Taylor. The rally that we have here, perhaps the mania, because that's what folks were calling it back in 2018 into 2019. Haven't heard that quite yet, but you hear about Bitcoin everywhere. You have Riot blockchain now up more than 1,400% on the year. It's hard to not call that a mania, given the fact that I was just looking at the financials. I know you love financials. This company is scheduled to make just $10 million this year, perhaps turn a small profit next year. So what is it that folks want about Riot blockchain? You have to think it's that connection to Bitcoin itself, which is also on a tear in a big way. Riot blockchain really outperforming Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin is the driver, what's next? You can look at it so many different ways. From a fundamental perspective, what are the fundamentals? I think you have to ask, when will it be more widely used as a payment system? Right now, it does continue to seem more like an investment vehicle. If we go into the Bloomberg terminal and take a look at what's happening here, it does appear to be overbought, but technically you can make the case that Bitcoin may still go even more. The boom and bust cycle may have further to go towards, say, let's call it 40,000. But history suggests that at some point a bust is more likely to follow that boom, so it could be a bit painful. As for Riot blockchain, if you try to look at its fundamentals, it of course is a Bitcoin miner, so it is very much in that mining business, and it last week alone bought 15,000 mining machines. To be outdone though by Core Scientific, a private company. So folks really want in on these mining companies. Again, the connection to Bitcoin. However, some of the peripheral stocks, Kevin, such as Overstock.com, Square, PayPal, and Nvidia, those stocks are down because we have this vaccine optimism, this reopening optimism. So some of the peripheral plays to Bitcoin are actually down on the day, Kevin.
Vaccine optimism. I feel like we all have that these days. Our thanks to Abigail Doolittle. And coming up next, China's tech crackdown puts Alibaba and sister company Ant Group in the crosshairs. The latest next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Taylor Riggs in New York. And Kevin, it's all fun and games until you do something to really tick off the Chinese government. And unfortunately, it is Jack Ma who is really learning that lesson right now. We know of him, of course, with his involvement in Alibaba. And then, of course, Ant Group, which had to scrap their IPO. And as you can see in the terminal chart here that we're showing, it is fears of a tech crackdown, antitrust regulation, fears of a breakup that is really pulling down all of the big tech companies in China. You've Alibaba, Tencent, JD.com. Again, antitrust is not something that you want to mess with in China and the Chinese government. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Sonali Basak, who's been following this story for us. And Sonali, give us an idea, of course, of how worried some of these companies and investors really are about a big tech crackdown.
Well, first of all, Taylor, this is a big deal for investment in big Chinese technology firms, big Chinese financial technology firms, which are among the world's most powerful and has drawn investment from investors around the world. So there's that issue. But there's also an issue for the big U.S. banks that have been expanding in China, working on the IPOs of these companies and all the companies that are associated with them. And some of these banks already have a lot, the global banks, right, have a lot of their revenue tied to business booming in this country. You know, when I've spoken to executives at some of the largest banks in the U.S. here, they tell me that they watch these giants as much as they watch the FANGs here.
Sonali, Does the Communist Party of China risk actually encouraging outside foreign investment from going into China as a result of this regulatory overreach, in the sense that maybe it's just too risky to do business in China and they might view, I don't know, other countries as a safer haven? Is there any risk for the Communist Party here?
Listen, with the two-day sell-off in Alibaba, this is painful, Kevin. But at the same time, most firms in the U.S., especially that do business in China, know of these risks. They look at China as this big long-term play. With that said, these regulatory risks are significant, and it does risk all the people that were at the fray, at the margins, right? And by the way, because of the delay of this massive IPO of Ant Group, you take away a massive exit opportunity that could have returned global investors 40 to 60 to maybe even 70 times more than they initially invested.
Jeanne, it's just so interesting. I was speaking with this source earlier, and they were kind of joking. Like, this is not just the FTC coming after you. This is the government of China, the Communist Party, really dictating then what you can do with the business and threatening a breakup and a return to the original payment system, of course, that some of these big tech had really started at. What is the bigger risk here of big tech in general in China, of really how careful you have to be when you go up and accidentally say something in front of the Chinese government? I mean, they pulled the entire IPO of Ant Group.
I think what you're trying to get at here, Taylor, and it makes absolute sense here, is how beholden are you to the Chinese government, right? Of course, when the regulators crack down so hard and so swiftly, remember, they did stop short here of demanding a breakup. But at the same time, they are posing risks to some of the biggest businesses and the biggest growth drivers of Ant Group. And you're not just seeing Ant Group decline. You're seeing companies like JD.com, which has not related to Ant Group, also start to feel the pain. So you are seeing this concern that started with Jack Ma and his relationship to the Chinese government start to float into other technology companies. Now back to Kevin's initial point, how much does that stifle future investment? Depends on who you are, right? I mean, we are at this point right now where you have the biggest banks in the world looking to up their base in China. And also, by the way, Taylor, in the last 12 months, the biggest IPOs in the world have still come from China, have come out of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. So it's hard to think that this will be a total clampdown. It would really stifle activity in a big way.
What's Jack Ma's leverage?
It's a huge company, right? I mean, this is a company that is already, right? If people are saying the IPO would bring it into the top ranks here of global finance, but really it already is, Kevin. And when you look at the biggest risk to the U.S. banks, as much as it is the big tech giants here, it's even more so the big financial giants in China, especially in the race to create a digital currency. So the faster China is on that, the more of a risk it is to the U.S. And it's a big risk for the governments, it's a big risk for technology, and it's a big risk for the financial systems. That's Jack Ma's leverage.
Jeanne, I know this is a little bit outside your wheelhouse, but try to follow the logic. When we were getting the DOJ and FTC crackdowns on big tech here in the U.S., it was Mark Zuckerberg who said, if you break us up, we can't compete with big tech in China. We have to be bigger here in the U.S. because we have to be able to take on big tech in China, which is taking over the world. If that is his logic, what then does it mean if big tech is getting smaller in China? Does it no longer make sense for big tech in the U.S. to play that argument as a way to not break up Facebook or Google here in the U.S.?
It's a great question, Taylor, and frankly, it is something that people will be watching toward the end of January after Biden's inauguration, because the tone that the Biden administration takes on two things, on big tech in the U.S. and also U.S.-China trade. Remember, Ant Group had mentioned that being a massive risk to their performance, right? And it also depends on where people list and the way that they attract global investors. Yes, it is a card that is harder to play, but it is still a card that he can play because there is so much relative power coming out of the tech giants, and certainly in industries like financial services that the U.S. tech giants do not really have much power in today.
What's the response been, Shanali, from Ant's competitors, from the up-and-comers in China who are developing new types of companies? Are they going to take this as a signal that they need to bend to the Communist Party, or are they going to look to go to another part of the world where this type of regulation process doesn't play out?
That's a great question, and honestly, it's something to really keep an eye on in not just the companies that are in China that are growing, but the companies outside of them. So Singapore, for example, huge booming technology and financial technology ecosystem. You're seeing the World Economic Forum really look there. You're seeing some of the biggest financial technology conferences in the world come out of Singapore. So how much are they competing with other areas, even in Asia, that really are drawing international investment is a real question.
Well, for every action, there is an opposite and equal reaction. Our thanks to Bloomberg's Shanali Bosick for breaking all of that important story down for us. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go to Karina Mitchell.
Okay, Kevin, thank you. President Trump has signed a bill containing $900 billion in pandemic relief, backing down from demands that lawmakers change the bill before he sign it. The legislation includes $1.4 trillion in government spending to fund federal agencies through the end of the fiscal year in September. The government had been operating on temporary spending authority that expires tonight at midnight. Meanwhile, the two Georgia runoffs that will decide control of the U.S. Senate begin their final stretch this week. President Trump heads back to Georgia to appear with the two incumbent Republican senators, David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, on the eve of their January 5th runoffs. The contest pit Democratic candidate Raphael Warnock against Loeffler and Perdue against Democrat Jon Ossoff after none of the candidates managed more than 50% of the vote in November. And Germany is pushing to ramp up production of COVID-19 vaccines as Europe faces pressure to close the gap with the UK and the US in a bid to end the pandemic. The EU rollout could be about 3 months behind that of the UK and the EU, and authorities are concerned the slower pace could force longer lockdowns and even more economic damage. Across Europe, there have been more than 400,000 reported deaths from the virus. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Karina Mitchell. This is Bloomberg. Kevin.
And coming up, as Karina said, it's the final countdown in Georgia this week. What the latest polling shows in the runoff elections that will decide what party controls the Senate. We're live in Atlanta next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Taylor Riggs in New York.
And I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington, D.C. The two runoff elections in Georgia that will decide control of the U.S. Senate begin their final stretch today, and President Donald Trump is putting himself in the middle of the campaign again. The president's complaints about the $600 stimulus checks payments in the latest relief package echo those of Democrats. Meanwhile, both Republican incumbents in Georgia have been promoting their votes for the bill with more limited aid. For the current picture in Georgia, we're joined by Alan Abramowitz of Emory University. He is a political science professor. Alan, thanks so much for joining us. All right, how has stimulus been playing in the closing arguments of the various campaigns?
Well, the Republican incumbents have been using their support for the stimulus bill that was passed by Congress as part of their argument for winning their election. They have been pushing, especially David Perdue has been using the argument that his support for the $900 billion bill, which includes a variety of forms of aid that would be beneficial to people here in Georgia, is a reason to return him to the Senate for another term. But at the same time that he was making that argument in his advertising, of course, President Trump was undermining that argument by attacking the bill and particularly attacking the $600 direct payments as inadequate. So that was a very strange kind of act by the president to be undermining not only the leadership of his party in Congress, but the candidates running in these key Senate races here in Georgia.
In terms of the issue of trust in the electoral process and get out the vote effort, how have Republicans tried to convince voters in the Republican Party that they can trust the process to show up to the polls, to mail in their ballots early, in which already a record number of individuals have voted already in a lead up to the Georgia runoff?
That's right. The turnout's been pretty extraordinary so far in this runoff. It's been sort of a problem for Republicans because, of course, President Trump, on the one hand, has been attacking the process, has been attacking the general election in November and claiming that, in fact, that he was the rightful winner of the election here and that the election was rigged. But at the same time, Republicans have been urging their voters to come out and vote in the runoff election, which is crucial in order to maintain control of the U.S. Senate. Both of the Republican candidates, both Perdue and Loeffler, on the one hand, have supported the president's claims that the election was rigged. Both of them actually called on the Republican Secretary of State to resign, which certainly is lending support to Trump's criticisms of the way the election was handled originally. Yet at the same time, obviously, both of them need Republican voters to come out in large numbers in order to win the runoff.
And are they coming out? Do we have any early indication of polling, of voter turnout?
Well, we know the turnout's strong overall, and that's pretty much true across the state. The polling indicates that we're headed toward another photo finish here. The polling before the general election, which unlike many of the other swing states was actually quite accurate, showed a neck-and-neck race in the presidential election as well as in the two Senate elections. And that appears to be what's happening again. If we look at the statistics so far on who has already voted, what we see is not only that the numbers are large and that it's coming from all across the state, but we do see something that's interesting that does show a bit of a change from the turnout in the early voting before the general election. That is that the African-American share of the voters so far in the early voting is larger than it was in the early voting before the general election. It's about 32% now versus about 27 or 28% then. We also have thousands of new voters who were not registered or did not vote, at least in the first election, who are voting this time. It's a small percentage of the overall vote, but it could be significant.
It's going to be fascinating to see how the evangelical black vote also turns out and how and who they ultimately vote for. That has been something that I can tell you Republican strategists have been really particularly focusing on. All right, our thanks to Alan Abramowitz of Emory University. So many policy implications on that Georgia runoff, including the makeup of the committees and the dynamics of how many Republicans and Democrats will be allocated to each of the committees. And again, Bloomberg TV and radio will have coverage of the Georgia election results starting at 7 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday, January 5th. Of course, that's the date of the election, Taylor.
Yes, and make sure to stay with us because coming up, Kevin, we are going to have more from our interview with Dr. Anthony Fauci. Of course, you know him as the director of the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Taylor Riggs in New York. And Kevin, we know that we all just came back from that Christmas holiday. And it also comes as the latest U.S. COVID numbers show about 19 million confirmed cases. Experts like Dr. Anthony Fauci really worried that more will be coming, particularly after this Christmas holiday. Last week, our own David Weston sat down with Dr. Anthony Fauci, of course, of the National Institute of Health. David asked Dr. Fauci whether the U.S. is to blame for not taking on more precautions or whether this disease is just too difficult to get our arms around. Take a listen.
This virus is really unprecedented in the last 102 years in its ability to spread in an extraordinarily efficient manner. It is a highly contagious virus. So even under the best of circumstances and the best of preparation, we still would be having a problem with this. And yes, there are things that we could have done better. We could have had a more uniform, consistent response that I have been talking about for some time now, instead of having multiple states doing things differently and not necessarily adhering to some of the guidelines that have been put forth about how to contain the virus and how to gradually and prudently open up the country and reopen up the economy.
Which raises the question of why has the United States done relatively much worse, certainly in the deaths per millions, than some other countries on the world, certainly Taiwan or South Korea or China or even Germany. And it's not, the numbers I've seen are not just like 20% worse, it's 5, 6, 7 times worse. What is that about? Is that the nature of our society? Is it a cultural issue? It is a leadership issue? What gave rise to that?
Yeah. You know, as I said in answer to your prior question, it's probably a little bit of all of the above. You know, first of all, our country is very different than some of those countries. If you look at New Zealand and Australia and Taiwan, they have the capability of just closing down things and not having an input. We're in a gigantic country, 330 million people, diversity across the entire country, geographically, climate-wise, cultural-wise, population-wise. You know, we have Wyoming and we have New York City. There's such a degree of difference. I think one of the key issues that has been very problematic is that one of the beauties of the United States of America is that it is the United States of America. It's a federalist system, and states can and do things according to their own independence. And that in some respects is very good because there's enough differences in the states. You want to give them the leeway to do that. However, when you're dealing with a pandemic infectious disease, you want to do things in a way that is consistent so that everybody's pulling together in the same direction, as opposed to different states, different regions, different areas doing things differently. It makes it very difficult to get a cohesive response when everybody's doing it a little bit differently. I think that's really been one of the stumbling blocks in our response to this pandemic.
It's a stumbling block, also an underinvestment in public health in this country. I've heard it said by some economists, we overinvest in private health and underinvest in public health.
Well, they're absolutely correct. I mean, we had a reasonably good local public health system decades and decades ago when we had a lot of tuberculosis and respiratory illnesses and sexually transmitted disease as a victim of our own success, as we had vaccines and antibiotics. It became clear that we were doing a great job. So we let the public health systems essentially go to attrit. I mean, there was a lot of attrition of what normally was a robust system. There's going to be a lot of lessons learned in all of this. One of them is to rebuild our local public health systems.
Looking in the long term, is this going to be a chronic illness for the human population? Is this going to be more like polio or smallpox we can eradicate and it's gone? Or is it going to be something we're going to have to deal with every year in one form or another?
Well, I don't think we're going to eradicate it. In all of history, we've only eradicated one human virus, and that's smallpox. I believe that we can control and likely eliminate it in certain countries, and that is going to be totally dependent upon the uptake of vaccines. I mean, we eliminated polio in our country. We eliminated, with few exceptions of sections that don't do it, namely measles. We've eliminated a number of other infections in this country. I believe that we could do it. Elimination is different than eradication. Eradication will be difficult to do.
So finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't wish you happy birthday. Tomorrow's your birthday, as I understand it. It'll be, you've set a different birthday. You're not going to be with your daughters. It's going to be Zooming instead of other things. Looking back on a remarkable career, you've served under Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, all of the above. Is this the most challenging year for you in your position? I mean, or have there been other years almost as difficult?
Well, there have been other groups of years that have been difficult. I mean, HIV/AIDS in the first several years was very tough. We had a very intense situation with Ebola. We had pandemic flu. We've had the anthrax attacks when we thought it was really bioterrorism and it was a homegrown person who did it. But I can say honestly that for the intensity of what we've gone through in a truncated period of less than a year, that has immobilized the whole planet, both from a public health and an economic standpoint, I would say that this really stands out as really one of the, if not the most challenging 11-month period that I've ever been through.
That was Dr. Anthony Fauci speaking with David Weston last week on Balance of Power. And coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we'll talk to Sean Kennedy of the National Restaurant Association. How do they feel additional stimulus might be needed in order to help those who are not able to get back to work? That's going to continue on Bloomberg TV and radio. We're also going to dive into the ongoing deal with Brexit negotiations. We'll get a full update as well. From Taylor Riggs in New York, I'm Kevin Cirilli from our Bloomberg Bureau in Washington, D.C. Much more coming on next. This is Bloomberg.